Welcome back to Legacy of Fear. What I'm about to share with you will shake everything you thought you knew about power, vengeance, and the occult forces that shaped America's darkest chapter. Deep in the cotton fields of Greene County, Alabama, where the humid air still carries whispers of the dead, a 14-year-old girl named Delilah Blackwood was held beneath the murky waters of a cotton gin reservoir until her lungs screamed for mercy and her vision faded to black. When they finally pulled her lifeless body from that water, something came back with her. Something ancient. Something that understood the language of suffering and spoke fluently in the dialect of retribution. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What happened next defies every natural law. Clarissa Whitfield, the mistress who ordered that drowning, would spend the final 8 months of her life wasting away in inexplicable agony, her flesh turning gray as ash, her screams echoing through Whitfield Manor until even her own husband couldn't bear to enter her chamber. The doctors found nothing. The ministers prayed uselessly. And Delilah Blackwood watched from the fields with eyes that now saw things the living were never meant to perceive. Our investigation has uncovered evidence that suggests this wasn't just folklore or exaggerated legend. Medical records from 1851 describe symptoms in Clarissa Whitfield that modern physicians still cannot explain. Witness testimonies buried in county archives speak of phenomena surrounding Delilah that challenge rational explanation. And the trail of deaths that followed her path northward creates a pattern too precise to dismiss as coincidence. This isn't sanitized history. This is the raw account of a woman who learned to weaponize the very forces that her captors feared most, who turned their superstitions into their destruction, and who walked a line between healer and destroyer so thin that even she couldn't always tell which side she stood on. The summer of 1845 in Greene County, Alabama was particularly brutal. The sun hung in the sky like a copper coin heated in fire, and the cotton fields stretched endlessly across the Black Belt soil, so named for its rich dark earth that had made white men wealthy and black bodies disposable. Whitfield Manor sat atop a gentle rise overlooking 300 acres of this profitable misery, its white columns gleaming with a purity that mocked the suffering that financed its grandeur. Delilah Blackwood had just turned 14 that June, though no one celebrated slave birthdays with any ceremony. She was tall for her age, with hands already calloused from years of field work and eyes that her mother Patience said saw too much for one so young. Delilah had inherited her mother's sharp cheekbones and her father's quiet intensity, a combination that made her beautiful in a way that brought both admiration and danger. The Blackwood family occupied a unique position among Whitfield's enslaved population. Solomon Blackwood was the plantation's master blacksmith, a craftsman whose skills were so valuable that he had negotiated small privileges other slaves never dreamed of. He could read, though he pretended illiteracy around white folks. He had convinced Thomas Whitfield to keep his family together by arguing that stable families produced more productive workers. It was a devil's bargain, but one that had kept his children from the auction block so far. Patience Blackwood worked in the big house as the head cook, a position that gave her access to knowledge other slaves lacked. She heard the conversations between Thomas and Clarissa Whitfield, learned which visitors brought news from beyond the plantation, and most importantly, had access to the kitchen garden where she grew herbs that served purposes far beyond seasoning food. Patience came from a long line of root workers, women who understood that plants held powers the white folks dismissed as superstition but secretly feared in the darkness of night. It was from Patience that Delilah first learned about the old ways, though her mother had been careful about what she revealed. There were some gifts, Patience warned, that came with prices too steep to pay willingly. There were some doors that once open could never be closed again. Delilah listened to these warnings with the casual dismissal of youth, not understanding that she stood on the threshold of a transformation that would redefine what it meant to be human. Delilah's older brother Ezekiel was 22 and worked in the fields as a driver, a position just below the white overseer that required him to push other slaves to meet their quotas. It was a position that earned him hatred from some and pity from others, but Zeke had accepted it as the only way to protect the younger slaves from Silas Grimshaw's whip. Grimshaw was the overseer, a man from the Tennessee Hill Country who had perfected cruelty into an art form. His face was weathered leather stretched over sharp bones, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had learned to take pleasure in others' pain because his own life offered so little joy. Delilah's younger sister Naomi was only 9, still young enough to work in the big house alongside their mother, learning the skills that might keep her out of the fields when she grew older. Naomi was bright and quick, with a smile that could charm even the hardest hearts, though Delilah worried constantly about what would happen when Naomi's childhood beauty transformed into womanhood under Clarissa Whitfield's jealous eye. The Blackwood family had once been larger. Delilah barely remembered her twin brothers Caleb and Joseph, sold away to a cotton trader named Barnabas Colt when they were only 6 years old and she was 4. The memory of their mother's screams that day had burned itself into Delilah's earliest consciousness, a foundational understanding that love meant nothing in a world where people were property. Patience had never fully recovered from that loss. Sometimes Delilah would find her mother standing perfectly still in the kitchen, tears streaming silently down her face, mourning children who would now be grown men she wouldn't recognize if she passed them on a road. It was the memory of Caleb and Joseph that made Delilah reckless that day in August when everything changed. She had been working the cotton gin with a group of other young slaves, feeding the white bowls into the machinery that separated fiber from seed. The work was dangerous. Every season someone lost fingers or worse to the hungry gears. But it was also marginally cooler than field work, sheltered under a roof with the gin's mechanisms creating at least some breeze. Clarissa Whitfield had chosen that afternoon to inspect the gin operations, a rare occurrence that put everyone on edge. Clarissa was 35 years old, beautiful in the brittle way of magnolia blossoms just before they brown, and possessed by a meanness that seemed to grow more concentrated with each passing year of her childless marriage. She had been raised in Charleston society and married Thomas Whitfield expecting a life of refined plantation elegance, only to discover that frontier Alabama was neither refined nor elegant, and that her husband preferred his whiskey and his slave quarters to her company. This particular afternoon, Clarissa's mood was especially venomous. She had just received word that her younger sister in Mobile had given birth to a third healthy son, a reminder of Clarissa's own failure to produce an heir. She arrived at the gin house looking for something or someone to absorb her rage, and her eyes fell upon Delilah with the precision of a hawk spotting prey. The accusation was as absurd as it was deadly. Clarissa claimed that Delilah had stolen a cameo brooch from her dressing table, a piece of carved ivory that had belonged to Clarissa's grandmother. The accusation made no sense. Delilah never entered Clarissa's private chambers and had no use for jewelry that would immediately mark her as a thief. But logic. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It had nothing to do with Clarissa's need for an outlet for her fury. When Delilah denied the theft, Clarissa's face transformed into something almost demonic with rage. She ordered Silas Grimshaw to search Delilah immediately, and when the search revealed nothing, Clarissa's anger only intensified. A crowd had gathered, slaves and overseers alike, drawn by the commotion. Clarissa Whitfield was not a woman accustomed to being contradicted, especially not by slave girls who looked at her with eyes that held no fear, only a calm certainty of innocence that infuriated her beyond reason. What happened next would be recounted in whispered conversations for decades. Clarissa ordered Delilah taken to the cotton gin's water reservoir, a large wooden tank that held water used to cool the machinery. The reservoir was 8 feet deep, its surface covered with a film of cotton debris and machine oil. Silas Grimshaw grabbed Delilah by her hair and forced her head beneath the surface while Clarissa watched with her arms crossed, her face expressionless except for a slight tightening around her mouth that might have been satisfaction or might have been something darker. Delilah fought at first. Her hands clawed at Grimshaw's arms, her legs kicked frantically, her lungs burned as she tried desperately not to inhale the foul water. She could see light filtering through the murky liquid, distorted and unreachable. She could hear muffled sounds of voices above, some shouting, others silent. Time stretched and compressed simultaneously. Seconds felt like hours. Her vision began to narrow, darkness creeping in from the edges. And then something inside her surrendered. Not to death, but to something else. In that moment of letting go, as her consciousness began to slip away, Delilah felt herself expanding beyond her drowning body. She could suddenly see herself from above, see Grimshaw's hands on her head, see Clarissa's face watching with cold satisfaction, see her brother Ezekiel being held back by two other overseers, see her mother running from the big house with her apron still tied around her waist. But she could also see more than what was visible to ordinary eyes. She could see a dark rot spreading through Clarissa Whitfield's body like ink in water, concentrated in her belly and reaching tendrils toward her heart. She could see the sickness that already lived inside the mistress, dormant but waiting. She could see the exact pathways that illness would take if given the right encouragement, the precise pressure points where a body's defenses could be breached. When Grimshaw finally pulled her up, Delilah's body was limp and blue. They laid her on the ground and someone thought she was dead. Patience Blackwood pushed through the crowd and fell to her knees beside her daughter, pressing her ear to Delilah's chest. For several terrible seconds there was nothing. Then Delilah convulsed, water exploding from her mouth and nose, her back arching as her body fought its way back to life. But the girl who opened her eyes and gasped in that first agonizing breath was not quite the same person who had been forced under the water. Something fundamental had shifted. Her eyes had a different quality now, as if they were looking through layers of reality that others couldn't perceive. When she looked at Clarissa Whitfield, she didn't just see a cruel mistress. She saw a map of vulnerabilities, a blueprint of how a human body could be unmade from within. They carried Delilah back to the slave quarters on a makeshift stretcher fashioned from cotton sacks, her body still shaking with violent tremors as water continued to leak from her nose and mouth. Patience walked beside her daughter, one hand gripping Delilah's cold fingers, the other pressed against her own chest as if to keep her heart from shattering. Solomon met them at the door of their cabin, his face carved from stone, eyes burning with a rage he couldn't express and wouldn't survive if he did. For 3 days and nights, Delilah drifted in and out of consciousness, her fever climbing so high that Patience wrapped her in wet sheets to keep her from burning up entirely. During those fevered hours, Delilah spoke in voices that weren't her own. She muttered in languages that Patience recognized as the old tongue her grandmother had spoken, words from across the ocean that shouldn't have existed in this 14-year-old girl's mouth. She described places she'd never been, events she'd never witnessed, people long dead who visited her in the shadows between sleeping and waking. Old Auntie Rue came on the second night. She was ancient beyond counting, a woman so old that even the oldest slaves couldn't remember her ever being young. Her face was a map of wrinkles, her hands gnarled like tree roots, but her eyes were sharp as broken glass and just as dangerous. She lived alone in a cabin at the farthest edge of the quarter, a place children were warned never to approach after dark. White folks left her alone partly out of fear and partly because even Thomas Whitfield wasn't fool enough to anger a woman who knew which plants could heal and which could kill with equal precision. Auntie Rue entered the Blackwood cabin without knocking, bringing with her the smell of wood smoke and something else, something ancient and earthy that made the hair stand up on the back of your neck. She carried a worn leather bag that clinked softly as she moved, and she set it down beside Delilah's pallet with the reverence of a preacher setting down a Bible. Patience started to explain what had happened, but Auntie Rue held up one gnarled hand for silence. She leaned over Delilah, her face inches from the girl's fevered features, and stared into her eyes with an intensity that seemed to penetrate straight through to whatever lay beyond. For a long moment, the only sound in the cabin was Delilah's ragged breathing and the soft crackle of the fire. When Auntie Rue finally straightened, her expression was unreadable. She turned to Patience and Solomon with a gravity that made both of them step back involuntarily. "What came back from that water ain't just your child," Auntie Rue said in a voice like gravel scraping over bone. "She died down there. Died proper. But something old, something that been waiting, it saw her sinking and it grabbed hold. Pulled her back through. Now she's standing with one foot in this world and one foot in the other, and she can see both sides clear as day." Solomon's jaw tightened, his blacksmith's hands clenching into fists. "Can you fix it?" he asked, though the question came out more like a demand. "Can you make her like she was?" Auntie Rue shook her head slowly. "Ain't nothing to fix. This ain't broken. This is opened." The girl got the sight now, the true sight. She can look at a body and see the sickness hiding inside. She can call things forth or push them back. She can work roots like I do, but stronger, because she been to the other side and came back with knowledge. The question ain't whether she got it. The question is what she gonna do with it. Patience sank onto a stool, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. My mama had the gift, she whispered. My grandmama before her. But they both said it was a burden heavy enough to break a strong back. Said it made you see things you wish you could unsee. Made you responsible for things you couldn't control. Auntie Roo nodded. That's the truth of it. But your girl, she already seen the worst this world got to offer. She already know what it mean to be held under till your lungs scream for mercy. Whatever burden the sight brings, it ain't gonna be heavier than what she already carrying. Might be she can turn this weight into a weapon. Might be she the one been waiting for. Over the following weeks, as Delilah slowly recovered her physical strength, the full extent of her transformation became apparent. She could no longer look at people without seeing the architecture of their bodies laid bare. When she looked at her father, she saw the old break in his left arm that had healed poorly, the slight weakness in his heart that would kill him years later. When she looked at Naomi, she saw her sister's perfect health radiating like sunlight, but also the potential for illness lurking in everyone, the thousand ways a body could betray itself. Most disturbing was what she saw when she looked at Clarissa Whitfield. The mistress had developed a cough in the weeks since the drowning, a dry persistent hack that she dismissed as seasonal irritation. But Delilah could see the truth. There was something wrong deep in Clarissa's belly, a darkness that pulsed with its own sick rhythm. It was small now, barely noticeable, but Delilah understood with absolute certainty that this darkness could grow. All it needed was the right encouragement, the proper conditions, and it would spread through Clarissa's body like kudzu vine choking out everything in its path. The knowledge sat in Delilah's chest like a hot coal. She hadn't put that sickness there. It had been waiting inside Clarissa all along, a seed of destruction the mistress carried in her own flesh. But Delilah understood that she had the power to water that seed, to help it grow, to guide its tendrils exactly where she wanted them to go. The realization was terrifying and intoxicating in equal measure. Auntie Roo began visiting the Blackwood cabin regularly, always after dark, always moving through the quarter like a shadow that existed independent of any light source. She taught Delilah the language of roots and bones, the grammar of spells written in graveyard dirt and blood. She showed her which herbs strengthened and which weakened, which combinations could heal and which could harm, which words spoken over which ingredients could amplify power tenfold. The lessons took place in a clearing deep in the woods that the slaves called the boneyard, though nobody could remember why it had that name or what bones might be buried there. Auntie Roo would build a small fire and arrange her ingredients in careful circles, explaining the logic of conjure work with the precision of a master craftsman teaching his trade. Conjure ain't magic, Auntie Roo explained one night as they knelt beside the fire. It ain't pulling something from nothing. It's understanding the connections between things. Everything alive got energy running through it. Plants got it. Animals got it. People got it strongest of all. When you work roots, what you doing is redirecting that energy, bending it like a river finding a new channel. You can't make water flow uphill, but you can dig a ditch and lead it where you want it to go. Delilah absorbed everything with a hunger that surprised even Auntie Roo. She had a natural aptitude that went beyond mere talent, as if the knowledge wasn't being learned so much as remembered. When Auntie Roo showed her how to prepare a healing poultice for wounds, Delilah instinctively understood which proportions would work best for different types of injuries. When they practiced protective spells, Delilah could feel the energy shifting around them, could sense the invisible barriers snapping into place. But it was the harmful work that came most naturally to Delilah, and this troubled Auntie Roo even as she taught it. There was a darkness in the girl, a cold fury that had calcified around her heart like mineral deposits around a stone. When Auntie Roo demonstrated how certain combinations of roots could bring on illness, Delilah's eyes gleamed with an intensity that had nothing to do with academic interest. "Child," Auntie Roo said one night, gripping Delilah's chin and forcing the girl to meet her eyes, "I teaching you this because you gonna learn it anyway, and better you learn it right than fumble around and hurt yourself or someone you don't mean to hurt. But you listened to me close. This kind of working, it got consequences. Every harm you send out into the world, it leave a mark on you. You kill with Conjure, you carry that death with you forever. It changed something in your spirit, make you a little less human and a little more something else. You understand what I'm saying? Delilah nodded, but Andy Rue could see the girl wasn't really hearing her. The rage burning in Delilah was too bright, too hot, fed by too many years of accumulated injustice. The drowning had been just the latest in a lifetime of indignities and cruelties, and something in Delilah had decided that she would never again be powerless, never again be held under while someone watched her drown. During this period of apprenticeship, Delilah maintained a careful facade of normalcy. She returned to work at the Cotton Gin, moving through her tasks with the mechanical efficiency of someone whose mind was always elsewhere. She attended the Sunday prayer meetings that Thomas Whitfield required all his slaves to attend, sitting in the back of the small wooden church while a white preacher droned on about obedience and accepting God's plan. But Delilah had her own relationship with the divine now, one that had nothing to do with the sanitized Christianity the white folks preached. Her faith was older, deeper, rooted in African traditions that had survived the Middle Passage and transformed themselves to survive in this new hostile world. She prayed to ancestors whose names she didn't know but whose blood ran in her veins. She asked for strength from spirits who understood what it meant to suffer and to fight back. Her mother Patience watched these changes with growing concern. She recognized the signs of someone walking the Conjure path because she had walked it herself in younger years before deliberately stepping away from it. Patience had seen what that power could do to a person, how it could consume you if you weren't careful, how the line between justice and vengeance could blur until you couldn't tell them apart anymore. One evening, as they prepared the evening meal in the big house kitchen, Patience confronted her daughter directly. She sent Naomi away on an errand, waited until they were alone, then turned to Delilah with tears streaming down her face. "I know what you're planning," Patience said quietly. "I can see it in your eyes every time you look toward the main house. I can feel it in the air around you, like a storm building. And I'm begging you, child, don't do this. Don't let what she done to you turn you into something you ain't." Delilah's hands never stopped moving, continuing to chop vegetables with mechanical precision. "What am I, Mama?" she asked in a voice devoid of emotion. "Tell me what I am." "Because the girl I was, she drowned in that water tank." "What came back? I don't even know what to call it." "You human," Patience insisted, gripping her daughter's wrist hard enough to stop the knife mid-motion. "You hurt and you angry and you got every right to both those things. But you still human, still my child, still got a choice about what you gonna do with this gift or curse or whatever you wanna call it. You use it to harm, even harm that feels justified, and you gonna lose yourself piece by piece until there ain't nothing left but the rage." Delilah finally looked up, and Patience flinched at what she saw in her daughter's eyes. There was no mercy there, no forgiveness, no room for reconciliation. There was only a cold calculation, a weighing of scales that had been unbalanced too long. "She held me under till I died," Delilah said softly. "She watched me drown for fun, for entertainment, because I made her feel small just by not being afraid of her. And you asking me to let that go? You asking me to turn the other cheek while she's still walking around free, still got the power to do it again to someone else?" "I'm asking you to stay human," Patience whispered. "I'm asking you to remember that vengeance don't end with one death. It spreads like poison, touching everything, ruining everything. You kill her, and what then? You think that gonna make you feel whole again? You think that gonna give you back what she took?" Delilah pulled her wrist free and returned to chopping vegetables, each cut precise and deliberate. "I don't want to feel whole, Mama. I want to feel powerful. I want to know that nobody ever gonna hold me under again. And if that make me less human, then maybe human ain't worth being in a world like this." The conversation ended there, but it opened a chasm between mother and daughter that would never fully close. Patience understood that she had lost this battle, that whatever choice Delilah made from here would be hers alone. All Patience could do was pray that somewhere in her daughter's scarred heart, there remained enough light to keep her from being completely consumed by darkness. As autumn approached and the cotton harvest began in earnest, Delilah's training with Auntie Rue intensified. The old woman seemed to sense that time was running short, that events were rushing toward a conclusion that couldn't be avoided. She taught Delilah the most dangerous workings, the ones that required blood and bone, the ones that could reach into a person's body and rearrange their fate. The most potent of these workings involved creating what Auntie Rue called a destruction doll. It required a personal item from the target, something that carried their essence, preferably something that had touched their skin or held their sweat. It required graveyard dirt from a fresh grave, preferably someone who had died violently or unjustly. It required specific herbs gathered at specific times, under specific moon phases. And it required the worker to bind their will to the working, to channel their intentions so purely that it became a living thing. Auntie Rue demonstrated the process once, using a chicken as the target to show Delilah exactly what would happen. She created the doll, bound it with red thread, spoke the words of power over it, then slowly, methodically, began to work it. Within days, the chicken sickened. Within a week, it was dead, wasted away to nothing despite having access to food and water. The other chickens wouldn't go near its body. "This is what you asking for," Auntie Rue said, pointing to the dead bird. "This is what you gonna do if you walk this path. And once you set this kind of working in motion, you can't take it back. It gonna run its course like a fire in dry grass, burning everything it touch until there's nothing left to burn. You sure this what you want?" Delilah stared at the dead chicken for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Teach me how to make it last," she said. "Teach me how to make it slow." The request chilled Auntie Rue to her core because it revealed something she had hoped wasn't true. Delilah didn't just want justice. She didn't just want to remove a threat. She wanted Clarissa Whitfield to suffer the way she had suffered, to feel herself dying by inches, to experience the terror of drowning in her own failing body. It was vengeance in its purest, most unforgiving form. Against her better judgment, Auntie Rue taught her. She showed Delilah how to calibrate the workings so it would progress slowly, giving the target's body time to recognize what was happening, allowing the fear to build alongside the physical deterioration. She explained how to anchor the spell so it would resist any countermeasures, how to hide it so other root workers wouldn't be able to detect and break it. She gave Delilah every tool she needed to become an instrument of prolonged destruction. The final component Delilah needed was something personal from Clarissa Whitfield, and opportunity presented itself in late October. Clarissa had ordered new dresses from a seamstress in Utah, and Patience was tasked with unpacking them and hanging them in the mistress's wardrobe. Delilah accompanied her mother on this errand, ostensibly to help carry the heavy boxes up the stairs. While Patience carefully arranged the dresses, Delilah's eyes scanned the bedroom with predatory focus. There, on Clarissa's vanity table, sat a silver hairbrush thick with strands of the mistress's auburn hair. Delilah's heart hammered in her chest as she calculated angles and timing. Patience was preoccupied with the dresses, her back turned. The bedroom door was open but the hallway was empty. It would take seconds. She moved with the fluid quickness of water finding a crack, her hand darting out to pluck several long strands from the brush. She wound them around her fingers, feeling the slight oil from Clarissa's scalp, the living essence still clinging to dead cells. This was enough. This was everything she needed. That night, deep in the boneyard, Delilah began her work. Auntie Rue sat nearby but didn't help, having told Delilah that this working had to be hers alone, that she couldn't share the spiritual burden of it. Delilah built her fire according to instructions, arranged her ingredients in the proper configuration, and began the process of creating the destruction doll. She used corn husks for the body, binding them with red thread stolen from her mother's sewing basket. She incorporated the graveyard dirt Auntie Rue had provided, soil taken from the grave of a young mother who had died in childbirth, her spirit still angry at being torn from her babies. She added bitter herbs, roots that promoted decay, powders that encouraged corruption. And she wove Clarissa's hair throughout the doll, binding the mistress's essence inextricably to this representation of her physical form. As she worked, Delilah chanted the words Auntie Rue had taught her, words in the old tongue that resonated in her chest like a second heartbeat. She felt power gathering around her, felt the temperature drop despite the fire, felt the air itself becoming heavy with intention. The hair on her arms stood up. Her vision sharpened until she could see individual sparks rising from the flames. She was aware of Auntie Rue backing away slowly, giving her space, giving the working room to breathe and grow. When the doll was complete, Delilah held it up to the firelight and felt a surge of connection. Somewhere in the big house, she knew, Clarissa Whitfield had just shivered for no reason she could name. The link was established. The channel was open. Now came the patient work of feeding energy through that channel, of encouraging the darkness already inside Clarissa to wake up and spread. Delilah wrapped the doll carefully in black cloth and buried it in a specific spot Auntie Rue had identified, a place where 3 paths crossed, where energy naturally pooled and intensified. She marked the spot with a small stone that looked like any other, memorable only to her. Then she returned to the quarter, washed her hands in water mixed with salt and hyssop, and lay down in her pallet beside her sleeping sister. She didn't sleep that night. She lay awake feeling the working she had set in motion, feeling it pulse with life, feeling it reach across the distance between the buried doll and Clarissa's sleeping form. It had begun. There was no turning back now. Within days, Clarissa would start to feel the first effects. Within weeks, the progression would be undeniable. Within months, it would be irreversible. Delilah stared at the dark ceiling of the cabin and felt no guilt, no remorse, no second thoughts. She felt only a cold satisfaction, a sense of scales beginning to balance. Clarissa Whitfield had held her under water and watched her die. Now Delilah would return the favor, slowly and methodically, giving the mistress plenty of time to understand exactly what was happening and why. In the darkness, Delilah smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of something that had been forged in suffering and tempered in rage, something that had discovered it could bite back and intended to sink its teeth deep. The Conjure woman of Alabama had been born, and her first working was already taking root in flesh that didn't yet know it was dying. The first sign appeared exactly 3 days after Delilah buried the doll. Clarissa Whitfield woke in the pre-dawn darkness with a sensation she would later describe to her doctor as feeling like spiders crawling beneath her skin. The feeling concentrated in her abdomen, a squirming discomfort that made her press both hands against her belly and cry out softly enough not to wake Thomas, who slept in the adjoining room with his customary whiskey-induced oblivion. She rose from bed and paced her chamber, trying to walk off the sensation, but it persisted through the morning and into the afternoon. By evening, she had convinced herself it was merely indigestion from the rich supper patients had prepared the night before. She took a spoonful of laudanum and went to bed early, willing her body to settle. But the sensation returned the next morning, stronger this time, accompanied by a bone-deep fatigue that made even the simple act of dressing feel like climbing a mountain. Clarissa sat at her vanity while her lady's maid buttoned her dress and noticed that her face looked different in the mirror. Her skin seemed less luminous, her eyes slightly sunken, as if she had aged a year overnight. She dismissed the observation as a trick of the light and went about her day with determined normalcy. Delilah watched from the kitchen where she was helping her mother prepare the midday meal. She could see Clarissa through the window that looked out onto the veranda, could see the mistress moving with less than her usual crisp efficiency. More importantly, Delilah could see what was invisible to everyone else. The darkness she had glimpsed inside Clarissa before was no longer dormant. It was awake and hungry, sending exploratory tendrils through surrounding tissue like roots seeking water. The working was progressing exactly as Delilah had designed it. The destruction doll buried at the crossroads was doing its patient work, feeding energy into the seeds of illness already present in Clarissa's body, encouraging them to grow and multiply and spread. It would take months for the full effect to manifest, months of gradual decline that would baffle physicians and terrify the mistress. Delilah intended to savor every moment. By the end of November, Clarissa's symptoms had multiplied and intensified. The fatigue had deepened into an exhaustion so profound that she often couldn't rise from bed until noon. Her appetite vanished, and the weight began to fall from her frame with alarming rapidity. Her skin took on a grayish cast that no amount of rouge could disguise. Most disturbing were the pains that came and went without pattern, sometimes sharp as knives, sometimes dull and grinding, always centered in her belly but radiating outward to her back and legs. Thomas Whitfield summoned Dr. Josiah Thornton from Utah, a portly man with impressive whiskers and an even more impressive collection of medical equipment that he deployed with great ceremony and little effect. He examined Clarissa thoroughly, asked detailed questions about her symptoms, consulted his medical texts, and ultimately declared that she was suffering from a disorder of the feminine humors that would likely resolve itself with rest and a regimen of tonics. The tonics did nothing. Clarissa continued to waste away, her body consuming itself from the inside out. By Christmas, she had lost so much weight that her dresses hung on her frame like curtains. Her hair, once lustrous and thick, began to thin and lose its color. Her eyes developed a fevered brightness that made her look simultaneously more alive and more dead. Delilah visited the buried doll regularly, usually in the dark hours before dawn when even the quarters were silent. She would dig it up carefully, unwrap it from its black cloth, and examine it by moonlight. The doll showed the effects of the working. The corn husks had begun to darken and decay, the red thread had loosened slightly, and there was a smell coming from it now, faint but unmistakable, the scent of something rotting from within. Each time she handled the doll, Delilah would speak to it softly, reinforcing her intention, feeding more energy into the working. She would describe to the doll what she wanted to happen next, how she wanted the illness to progress, which symptoms she wanted to intensify. It was intimate work, this slow murder, requiring attention and care and a sustained focus that Delilah found came naturally to her. Auntie Rue stopped visiting the Blackwood cabin. She had made her position clear after teaching Delilah the destruction working. "I ain't gonna watch this," she had said. "I ain't gonna be part of what comes after. You made your choice, child, and now you got to walk that path alone. When you're ready to learn the healing work, the building up work instead of the tearing down work, you come find me. But until then, I can't have nothing to do with you." The old woman's rejection stung more than Delilah wanted to admit, but she understood it. Auntie Rue had taught her the dangerous knowledge, but she couldn't condone its use, couldn't stand witness to murder even when that murder wore the face of justice. It was a line the old Conjure woman wouldn't cross, and Delilah respected that even as she plunged headlong across it. Patience knew what her daughter was doing even though they never spoke of it directly. She saw the dark circles under Delilah's eyes from nights spent in the woods. She noticed the way Delilah watched Clarissa with cold assessment rather than the fear or hatred you might expect. Most tellingly, she observed how Delilah's demeanor changed as Clarissa's health deteriorated. Her daughter seemed to be drawing strength from the mistress's weakness, growing more confident and powerful as Clarissa faded. The dynamic in Whitfield Manor shifted in subtle but significant ways. Thomas Whitfield, faced with his wife's mysterious illness, spent even more time away from the house, attending the plantation business or drinking with neighboring planters or visiting the slave quarters in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. His absence left a power vacuum that Clarissa, even in her weakened state, tried desperately to maintain. But Clarissa's grip on household authority was slipping. Her orders became confused and contradictory. She would demand that patients prepare elaborate meals then be unable to eat more than a few bites. She would insist on supervising the cleaning of rooms then have to retreat to her chamber after only minutes of standing. The slaves in the big house, while never openly defiant, began to take liberties they would never have dared before. Delilah found herself in an increasingly powerful position. As Patience's assistant in the kitchen and increasingly her mother's surrogate when Patience was occupied with other duties, Delilah had access to the main house in ways that other field slaves didn't. She could move through the rooms with relative freedom, could observe Clarissa's decline firsthand, could make subtle adjustments to enhance the working's effects. She began adding ingredients to Clarissa's food, nothing that would show up as poison, just herbs and roots that would amplify her discomfort, intensify her symptoms, make sleep impossible and waking torment. A pinch of this in the morning tea to increase anxiety. A touch of that in the evening broth to worsen the pain. Small additions that compounded the destruction doll's work and accelerated the timeline Delilah had set in motion. By February, Clarissa was confined to her bed almost entirely. Dr. Thornton had been summoned 3 more times and had brought colleagues from Mobile and Montgomery to consult. They ran every test available to 19th-century medicine, applied leeches and blistering plasters, prescribed increasingly desperate combinations of mercury and arsenic and opium. Nothing helped. If anything, the medical interventions seemed to worsen Clarissa's condition, adding iatrogenic suffering to her organic decline. The doctors couldn't understand it. There was no fever to suggest infection. No clear signs of cancer, though they suspected it. No symptoms of the usual wasting diseases. Clarissa was simply dying, her body shutting down system by system for no reason they could identify. One physician from Mobile suggested it might be a disorder of the mind rather than the body, that Clarissa's symptoms were manifestations of hysteria or melancholia. This diagnosis enraged Thomas and terrified Clarissa, who knew with absolute certainty that what was happening to her was physical and real and absolutely unstoppable. It was during this period that Clarissa began to suspect supernatural causes. She had grown up hearing stories about Conjure and hoodoo, had been warned by her Charleston relatives that the slaves practiced dark arts inherited from their African ancestors. She had always dismissed such talk as superstition meant to frighten impressionable white women. But now, wasting away with no medical explanation, Clarissa's mind turned toward explanations that science couldn't provide. She began to remember things with new significance. The drowning incident in August. The way Delilah had looked at her afterward, not with fear or hatred but with something cold and calculating. The fact that her symptoms had begun shortly after that incident. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Clarissa became convinced that Delilah had somehow cursed her, had used slave magic to strike her down in retaliation for the punishment. Clarissa shared these suspicions with Thomas one evening when the pain was particularly bad and the laudanum had loosened her tongue enough to speak what she had been thinking. She told him about the drowning, framing it as justified discipline for theft, and about her suspicion that Delilah had somehow bewitched her in revenge. Thomas listened with the patient tolerance of a man humoring a sick woman, but he didn't believe her. He had no faith in conjure or curses, and he couldn't imagine that a slave girl possessed power that white physicians couldn't combat. But Clarissa's paranoia grew as her body failed. She refused to eat anything that Patience or Delilah had prepared, insisting that her meals be cooked by other house slaves and tasted by them first. She had her chamber swept daily for conjure bags or hidden charms. She hired a white preacher to come and bless her room, to pray over her bed, to read scripture meant to dispel evil influences. None of it made any difference. The thing eating her from the inside out wasn't something prayer could touch. Delilah knew about Clarissa's suspicions because the house slaves talked freely in the quarters, and word traveled fast. She found the mistress's paranoia deeply satisfying. It wasn't enough that Clarissa was dying. Delilah wanted her to know why, to understand that this suffering was payment for the drowning, to spend her final months in the terror of recognizing that she was completely powerless against forces she had foolishly believed didn't exist. In early March, Delilah made a calculated decision to confirm Clarissa's worst fears. She prepared a small conjure bag, a mojo hand filled with graveyard dirt, sulfur, and other ingredients associated with cursing work. She placed it under Clarissa's mattress, positioning it so it would be found during the next changing of linens. The discovery would serve no practical purpose in the working itself, but it would shatter Clarissa's fragile mental state and intensify her suffering in ways that purely physical illness couldn't achieve. The mojo hand was discovered exactly as Delilah intended. The housemaid who found it screamed and dropped it as if it had burned her hand. Clarissa, hearing the commotion, demanded to see what had been found. When they showed her the small cloth bag with its sinister contents, something broke inside the mistress. She began screaming accusations, demanding that Thomas round up every slave on the plantation and whip them until someone confessed to placing the curse. Thomas, finally confronted with what he could no longer dismiss as his wife's delusion, agreed to investigate. He summoned Silas Grimshaw and ordered him to search the slave quarters for evidence of conjure work. Grimshaw, who believed in hoodoo even if Thomas didn't, approached the task with the zeal of a man rooting out evil. He tore through cabins, scattered belongings, questioned slaves with barely restrained violence. The search yielded nothing because Delilah had been careful. The destruction doll remained buried at the crossroads, well away from the plantation buildings. The ingredients she used were common enough to be explained away. The knowledge in her head couldn't be found by any search. When Grimshaw and his men came to the Blackwood cabin, Delilah stood calmly while they ransacked her family's meager possessions. She met Grimshaw's eyes with a level gaze that held neither fear nor challenge, just a stillness that made the overseer inexplicably nervous. "You know something about this," Grimshaw said, more statement than question. His hand gripped the handle of his whip, knuckles white with the desire to use it. "I can see it in your eyes. You're mixed up in whatever darkness killing the mistress." Delilah tilted her head slightly, her expression neutral. "I'm just a slave girl, sir. I don't know nothing about curses or conjure. That's white folks' superstition. We just trying to survive day to day." The denial was perfectly pitched, containing just enough deference to be believable while maintaining the core of steel that Grimshaw found so unsettling. He wanted to beat her, wanted to force a confession, but Thomas had given strict orders against harming slaves without clear evidence. The plantation couldn't afford to lose valuable property based on suspicions and paranoia. Grimshaw backed down, but the look he gave Delilah promised that this wasn't over. After the search proved fruitless, Clarissa's mental state deteriorated rapidly. She became convinced that every slave on the plantation was in league against her, that they all knew about the curse and were conspiring to let her die. She saw malice in every face, heard mockery in every word spoken around her. The paranoia compounded her physical suffering, creating a feedback loop of agony that no medicine could touch. She began having nightmares, vivid dreams where she was drowning in dark water while faces watched from above. In these dreams, Delilah was always there, holding her under, pressing down on her chest, whispering words in a language Clarissa didn't understand but knew were sealing her fate. She would wake screaming, her bedclothes soaked with sweat, her heart hammering so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. The household staff began to avoid Clarissa's chamber. Her screams disturbed the entire house, her rages exhausted everyone who tried to care for her, and there was a smell coming from her room now, a sickly sweet odor of decay that no amount of lavender water could disguise. Thomas moved his sleeping quarters to the far end of the house. The doctor's visits became less frequent as Thornton admitted there was nothing more he could do. By April, Clarissa weighed less than 90 pounds. Her skin had taken on a yellowish cast, stretched tight over bones that seemed to push through from within. Her hair had thinned to wispy strands that clung to her skull. Her eyes had sunk deep into their sockets, burning with fever and fear in equal measure. She looked like something exhumed rather than living, a walking corpse that had somehow forgotten to finish dying. Delilah visited Clarissa's chamber regularly now, bringing meals the mistress wouldn't eat, adjusting curtains, emptying chamber pots. Clarissa could no longer protest Delilah's presence. She could barely speak at all anymore, her voice reduced to a thin whisper that required enormous effort to produce. But her eyes followed Delilah around the room with undisguised terror and hatred, understanding finally and completely that this girl was the instrument of her destruction. During one of these visits, Delilah leaned close to Clarissa's ear, close enough that her whisper would reach no one else. "Do you remember the water tank?" she murmured softly. "Do you remember holding me under, watching me drown, taking pleasure in my suffering?" "I remember. I remember every second. And I wanted you to know, before you die, that this is payment. This is what happens when you underestimate what a drowning girl might become when she finds her way back to air." Clarissa tried to scream but could only produce a thin wheeze. Her skeletal hands clutched at the bedsheets, her eyes rolling in terror. Delilah straightened, smoothed her apron, and left the room with measured steps, leaving Clarissa alone with the knowledge that she was dying by inches at the hands of someone she had tried to kill and failed to finish. The end came in late May, 8 months after Delilah had buried the destruction doll. Clarissa Whitfield died in her bed just before dawn, her final hours marked by convulsions and the kind of pain that made even hardened physicians look away. Her last coherent words, spoken to the night nurse who sat with her, were a confession. "The girl," she whispered. "The Blackwood girl. She cursed me. She killed me. Tell someone. Make them understand." But the nurse, an older slave woman who had no love for Clarissa Whitfield, simply nodded and said nothing. When Clarissa finally stopped breathing, the nurse waited a full hour before raising the alarm, giving the mistress's spirit time to depart and ensuring there would be no possibility of revival. When she finally informed Thomas of his wife's death, she made no mention of Clarissa's final confession. Some knowledge was too dangerous to share, and some revenges were too perfect to interrupt. The funeral was a subdued affair. Clarissa had no children to mourn her, few friends who genuinely cared about her passing. Thomas went through the motions with the mechanical efficiency of a man performing a social obligation rather than grieving a loss. The neighboring planters attended more out of courtesy than affection. The slaves stood in the background, their faces appropriately solemn, their hearts singing with the dark joy of watching their oppressor lowered into the ground. Delilah stood with her family during the burial, her head bowed, her expression blank. But inside, she felt something she hadn't experienced since before the drowning. She felt powerful. She felt vindicated. She felt like she had reclaimed something essential that Clarissa had tried to take from her. The woman who had held her underwater was now buried under earth, and the symmetry of that justice satisfied something deep in Delilah's scarred soul. That night, Delilah returned to the crossroads and dug up the destruction doll for the final time. It was barely recognizable now, the corn husks blackened and disintegrated, the thread rotted away, the whole thing collapsed into a shapeless mass of decay. She unwrapped it from its cloth and held it up to the moonlight, examining her handiwork with the critical eye of a craftsman assessing a completed project. The doll had served its purpose perfectly. The working had progressed exactly as designed. Clarissa had suffered precisely as much as Delilah had intended and not a moment more or less. It was a masterpiece of controlled destruction, a demonstration of power that proved Delilah had become something far beyond what anyone had expected from a drowned slave girl. She built a small fire and burned the doll, watching as flames consumed the last physical evidence of her revenge. The smoke rose straight up into the night sky, carrying away the final traces of Clarissa Whitfield's essence. When only ash remained, Delilah scattered it in the 4 directions, releasing the energy she had bound so tightly for 8 months, letting it dissipate back into the universe from which it had come. As she walked back to the quarters through the pre-dawn darkness, Delilah felt different. The rage that had sustained her through the months of working had burned itself out along with the doll. What remained was a cold clarity, an understanding of exactly what she was capable of and what that capability meant. She had killed a woman slowly and deliberately using methods that left no evidence a court would recognize. She had proven that even in a system designed to render her powerless, she possessed power that white folks couldn't comprehend or combat. But Auntie Rue's warning echoed in her mind. Every harm you send out into the world, it leave a mark on you. Delilah could feel that mark now, could sense how the working had changed something fundamental in her spirit. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had become something that wasn't quite human anymore, or perhaps was more human than most people ever dared to be, willing to claim the darkest parts of human nature and use them without flinching. She didn't regret what she had done. Clarissa Whitfield had deserved everything she got and more. But Delilah understood with perfect clarity that this was only the beginning. She had discovered a power that could protect her, could punish her enemies, could carve out space for dignity and agency in a world designed to crush both. And she intended to use that power, whatever the cost to her soul. The Conjure woman of Alabama had claimed her first victim, but she would not be the last. The path Delilah had started down led away from Whitfield Manor, away from slavery itself, toward a future she could barely imagine but could sense waiting for her like a destination already decided. All she had to do was keep walking, keep working, keep becoming whatever she needed to become to survive and help others survive in a world that wanted them all dead or broken. In the weeks following Clarissa's burial, the atmosphere at Whitfield Manor underwent a strange transformation. Thomas Whitfield, freed from his wife's increasingly demanding presence and paranoid accusations, seemed almost relieved despite the social requirement of mourning. He wore black armbands and accepted condolences with appropriate solemnity, but those who knew him well noticed a lightness in his step that hadn't been there during Clarissa's long decline. The slaves noticed too, and they understood what it meant. A plantation without a mistress was a plantation with one less overseer, one less pair of eyes watching for infractions, one less voice demanding punishments for imagined slights. The big house felt different now, less oppressive, as if Clarissa's malevolent spirit had been so powerful that even its absence created a vacuum that changed the very air they breathed. Delilah moved through this changed landscape with careful neutrality. She knew that some of the house slaves suspected her involvement in Clarissa's death, though none would ever speak such suspicions aloud. There were looks exchanged when she passed, conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room, a mixture of fear and grudging respect that followed her like a shadow. She had become someone to be reckoned with, someone who possessed power that transcended her legal status as property. Patience watched her daughter with eyes full of sorrow and a kind of resigned understanding. She had lost Delilah in a way that was different from but no less painful than losing Caleb and Joseph to the slave trader. Her daughter's body still moved through the world, still performed its daily tasks, still sat across from her at meals. But the girl who had existed before the drowning was gone completely now, replaced by something harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous. Solomon spoke to Delilah only once about what had happened, pulling her aside one evening after supper when they had a rare moment of privacy. He looked at his daughter with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between pride and grief. "What you did," he said quietly, his blacksmith's hands rough and warm as they gripped her shoulders, "that was your choice to make. I ain't gonna judge it. Maybe she had it coming. Maybe justice looked like revenge when you've been held down long enough. But you listen to me now, girl. You got power, real power, the kind that can protect or destroy. You decide which one you gonna be. Don't let what she done to you define what you become." Delilah nodded, accepting her father's wisdom even as she knew it might be too late for such choices. She had already crossed into territory that changed the fundamental nature of who she was. The question wasn't whether she would use her power again, but how, and when, and for what purpose. The working she had done on Clarissa had been personal, driven by a need for vengeance that burned so hot it consumed everything else. But standing in the aftermath, feeling the weight of what she had accomplished, Delilah began to wonder what else such power might achieve if directed toward different ends. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.